What's up, everybody? I'm Mnar Adley, founder and director of MintPress News. Welcome to our official podcast for MintPress News called the MintCast. Now, there are some weeks where decades happen all at once. Syria has fallen and Assad has fled, and al-Nusra founder Abu Mohammad al-Julani has now taken power, much to the joy of his backers in Ankara, Tel Aviv, and Washington, D.C., who are working around the clock to remove him and his organizations from their terrorist lists. So, how did this all happen, and how did Syria collapse so quickly? How will this affect the region, and what does this mean for the axis of resistance? And now we are joined by Professor Dr. Mohammed Marandi. He is a professor and advisor to the government in Iran. He's based in Tehran, and it's a pleasure to be joined by you, Dr. Marandi. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. Just one thing, I'm not an advisor. I was a media advisor to the nuclear negotiating team in 2015 and 3 years ago.
Oh, thank you for correcting me. I appreciate that. Sorry about that. And so we wanted to bring you on, Dr. Marandi, because we wanted to hear from a Syrian perspective what was happening on the ground, but it would be good to get your perspective about what this really means for the axis of resistance and Iran's role, and where Iran and the axis of resistance are going to be headed moving in the future, because what has taken place in Syria with the fall of Assad and the takeover by HTS, and with the government of Benjamin Netanyahu basically taking some credit for what has happened in Syria, this has been a major blow for the resistance in the region, and I'm sure for Iran and Russia as well. So first, let me just get your reaction to what has happened now with the fall of Assad and the rise of al-Qaeda inside Syria.
Well, if we go back to 2011, with the rise of al-Qaeda in Syria, the Iranians became deeply concerned. They didn't get involved until 2013, as did Hezbollah and others. And that was because by that time there were already tens of thousands of foreign fighters inside Syria, which had come mostly from Turkey. Turkish intelligence, along with other NATO countries and oil and gas-rich family dictatorships in the Persian Gulf, they all facilitated the movement of extremist terrorists to Syria. And so in 2013, when their numbers rose immensely and they were al-Qaeda and ISIS, the Iranians began to intervene. So back then, the issue was not a legitimate opposition. The issue was al-Qaeda. And we have to remember that Jake Sullivan on February the 12th, 2012 said to Hillary Clinton in an email that in Syria, al-Qaeda or al-Qaeda is on our side. And of course, we know from the 2012 Defense Intelligence Agency document that regional regimes, including Erdogan and others, were trying to create a Salafist entity between Syria and Iraq. That, of course, was ISIS. And General Michael Flynn, who had led that agency, he said that Obama supported this policy. In other words, supported empowering ISIS. And Kerry, too, in a leaked audio, said that the U.S. allowed ISIS to advance on Damascus. And there's a lot of other evidence. And of course, Iranian intelligence saw this from the very beginning. What we saw more recently was a repeat of the same problem. The Iranians, their concern was about the rise of al-Qaeda and ISIS, because both of them are heavily infiltrated by Western intelligence agencies, including Turkey and other regimes in the Persian Gulf. And they are extremist groups. Otherwise, the issue for Iran is not an opposition, or they have no obsession with preserving former President Assad. The issue was always al-Qaeda. And so right now, as we see Syria fall, the Iranians, I think, were expecting what we see today, that the Israelis would be gloating, that Netanyahu would be taking credit, that Biden would be taking credit, and that Erdogan, because of his own ego and his own selfish interests, has put the Israeli regime in a very strong position, to be very blunt. Uh, the Israeli regime had lost the war because in order they had to win. The very fact that they couldn't defeat Hezbollah meant that the Israeli regime lost. The fact that they couldn't exterminate the Palestinian population in Gaza meant that they had lost. The fact that they couldn't have the upper hand in the missile and exchanges and drone exchanges with Iran meant that they lost. But this was a major stab in the back to the axis of resistance, which needed Syrian territory to help the Palestinian people. And it's not just Lebanon, it's also the West Bank. It's over now, but the weapons that you see in the West Bank, the capabilities that you see in the West Bank, they all go through Syria. So that is going to be a major challenge in the future, especially since it is well known that al-Qaeda, the leaders of al-Qaeda in Syria have no intention whatsoever to confront the Israeli regime. And we do not see that as we speak. They've allowed the Israelis to destroy Syria's military infrastructure. They have not protested. They have not said anything. And we've seen them allow the Israeli regime to advance close to Damascus. And again, they have done nothing about it. And only today, apparently, as Erdogan said, made some verbal complaint. But this is the same Erdogan that's been selling or facilitating the sales of oil from cheap oil from Baku to Netanyahu for the last 14 months. He's preserved ties. Senior intelligence officers go back and forth. So it is a difficult situation, without a doubt, for the resistance. It will be difficult for Hezbollah, although Hezbollah's military infrastructure, contrary to what the West says, is intact. Its underground tunnels across southern Lebanon and central Lebanon are very much intact. Its weapons, they have enough weapons to fight for a very, very long time. Also, Iran has been able to send in a lot of support to Gaza, even though Gaza was fully surrounded. Lebanon is not a fully surrounded country, and there are ways to do things for Lebanon that have already been done for the people of Gaza and for the people of Yemen during the Saudi war on Yemen, where the Americans were patrolling the Red Sea back then. But even then, Iranian support was getting to Yemen, it was getting to Gaza, and I don't think that Hezbollah is really that worried. Although it would be it would be a challenge, it would be difficult, but they'll manage.
Well, there's a lot of, doom and gloom talk out there right now that the axis of resistance is done. It's over. This is the end of the axis of resistance. Of course, I don't know if I agree with that perspective. Maybe one channel has been cut off, but that doesn't mean that the fight and access to and the unity among certain nations and groups to continue to resist Israeli occupation and expansionist interests has necessarily ended, because, like you said, there are other ways. I don't know what those other ways are, of course, because, I don't know. I'm not in those internal circles. But it seems like there's two debates going on, that the axis is over with, it's done. And then there's one that's like, wait a second, we don't know actually the full picture. So what is your perspective? I mean, how is the axis going to move forward? And do you think the axis of resistance is done and complete for? I just spoke with Kevork, who's a Syrian journalist, and his perspective was that the axis is now over. It's done. What do you think?
No, I don't believe that to be the case. I think that Hezbollah will emerge stronger. Uh, the war taught it a lot of lessons about the Israeli regime's capabilities and its vulnerabilities. They will rearm, they will reorganize, and they will be able to be an effective resistance force in future. I think that despite the fact that Netanyahu did achieve a big score or a big win in Syria for the short term, the delegitimization of Zionism in the eyes of the global public, the fact that the world has seen a Holocaust being carried out against Palestinians, that is not something that can be reversed. And that is probably the biggest win for the axis of resistance, the, the, the delegitimization of the Israeli regime in the eyes of so many people, even in the West. In addition to that, I think that the situation in Syria is not going to be so easily controlled by the Israelis or Mr. Erdogan or the Americans. Al-Qaeda is a group with a very extremist tendency, a very extremist ideology, and Jolani, who of course was a lieutenant, a deputy for Abu Bakr Baghdadi when he was the head of the Islamic State of Iraq. He was sent, so he was in ISIS, he was sent to set up a Nusra in Syria. So he commanded the al-Qaeda faction in Syria, because back then the Islamic State of Iraq was al-Qaeda. They later separated. So it's the same ideology, but Jolani and Abu Bakr Baghdadi had a fallout over power. It became, the Islamic State of Iraq became the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham or Syria, and Jolani didn't accept that. And interestingly, Al-Qaeda Central, the Central Command, sided with Jolani. And that's why ISIS broke away from Al-Qaeda, because of their support for Jolani's position. But his supporters are extremists. Even if he wanted to become more moderate, and with the background of ISIS and Al-Qaeda that he has, that's not something that I can really imagine. But even if he wanted to move in a different direction, his supporters would not, many of his supporters would not accept that. And more importantly, many of the other factions will not accept that. And we've already seen that in Idlib. During the past few years in Idlib, we've seen a lot of conflict. We've seen the different factions attack each other, kill each other, take over each other's military bases, and then the other side counter striking. So in that small territory called Idlib, these groups couldn't tolerate each other. And now with this huge country being controlled by them, I do not see them as being able to preserve their unity. And also, the situation in Syria is getting worse. The Israeli regime has destroyed the military infrastructure. These groups that came into the cities, they themselves or other people, they've been looting and looting the central bank, looting government buildings, destroying government buildings. This is only going to make the situation worse. And these people are not the sort of people who can run a country. So I think the situation in Syria is going to be complicated. They'll be fighting with Kurdish groups. And we already see the beginning of the slaughter of minorities, especially in Latakia. Today, a lot of footage is coming out of mass killings. So I don't believe they're going to be able to stabilize Syria. And I think actually in the long term, and this is sorry for this long response, but this is where I wanted to get to. The countries that have been supporting Al-Qaeda, I think in the long run, they are the ones who are going to suffer the most. Turkey is going to have a huge burden is going to be burdened by Syria, not just because of the extremism that's going to come out of Syria. And remember, there are many thousands of foreign fighters, and this is already causing anger in China. But Central Asia countries are going to have a problem with Turkey because it's taking their citizens and turning them into killers. But Turkey is also going to have economic problems because of the burden of Syria. They're going to have to fund, along with Qatar, they're going to have to fund al-Qaeda in order, and that is it's going to cost a lot more than the funding that they've been providing for Adley. But even beyond Turkey and Qatar, I think that the spread of extremism is a real possibility. Remember, just as an example, Jordan aside, Egypt aside, right now Mohammed bin Salman has pushed Saudi Arabia in a very different direction from the past. In the past, Malik Abdullah, he used to see himself or be presented as as the, let's say, the godfather of Wahhabism and Salafism. And Mohammed bin Salman is the exact opposite. He has moved Saudi Arabia towards secularism. He brings half-naked women singers and dancers to ceremonies and concerts, uh, and that is not something that the Salafists or the Wahhabis would find acceptable. So not only did he and others do nothing for Gaza, as the Holocaust was being carried out, and it still is being carried out as we speak. But now we have a successful al-Qaeda revolution, or al-Qaeda coup, or al-Qaeda takeover. And I think a lot of people in Saudi Arabia will be thinking about that. They'll say, well, our al-Qaeda brothers in Syria were able to achieve revolution. We should overthrow the regime here and bring their Islam,
Their
to Saudi
Islam. Gotta
Arabia.
make that clear. Their Islam. Right.
Yes, it's not your Islam or my Islam, but their Islam. Yeah,
Right.
and it's just like it's the same. Al Qaeda and ISIS have nothing to do with Sunni Islam. They are this is Wahhabism, just as Zionism has nothing to do with Judaism, just as the Nazis have nothing to do with Christianity. So sadly, these groups have allowed the Orientalists and those who are Islamophobic and those who are antagonistic towards Muslims to show them as representatives of Muslims in Islam, but that's of course not the case. They are more linked to Western intelligence agencies than they are to the indigenous Muslim populations.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned that kind of bigger, longer perspective, because I think people are looking at what's happening now and thinking, "Oh my gosh, this is a huge blow for the axis of resistance," and they're not seeing the ramifications possibly of how encouraging and supporting these, black flag bearers and al-Qaeda groups is going to actually have a big blowback on the very countries that support them. And that's a very interesting perspective to share, because I don't think a lot of people have said that. So it's definitely food for thought and something for a lot of people to think about. Now, I think a lot of people are also wondering, where was Iran when this HTS takeover took place? Where was Iran and Russia and China? Where were they when this happened? People have asked, how could they have allowed this to happen? But I think that people have to remember that Syria is a sovereign nation, and Assad and his government have their own military and their own army. And actually, Iran and Russia were not really involved that much inside Syria at that time when all of this happened. Maybe on an outsider advisor perspective, but not really on the ground. And so could you tell us, where was Iran and what was Iran saying to Assad? Were they trying to preserve his presidency or not? What happened with the Assad-Iran relationship that led up to this point?
Well, in 2012, 13, 14, I used to say this on international media. Uh, when I was invited, I would say it on Al Jazeera as well. And then I was banned from Al Jazeera for quite a while. But Iran, from the very beginning, was calling on the uh, the government in Syria to change its policies, to uh, take into consideration more consideration the needs of civil society, and to treat people who may be protesting or people who they arrest in a better way. And that did cause friction between Iran and the Syrian government. And as I said, the Iranians did not get involved in Syria, or nor did Hezbollah, until 2013. And by that time, there were massive numbers of foreign fighters in the country. And the foreign fighters, as well as the Syrian extremists who were members of ISIS and al-Qaeda or their affiliates, Jaish al-Islam, and other such groups, both the foreigners and the Syrians who were members, they were very dangerous. They were dangerous for the region. They were dangerous for Iran. They were dangerous for Iraq. They were dangerous for Lebanon. So Iran felt it had to get involved. In this case, it was very different. Although Iran had warned President Assad of the situation in Idlib, not much was done. And Iran's warnings came. They were different types of warnings, but from 6 months ago till a couple of months ago, Iran had told them this. And I think the Syrians probably knew as well. They had their own sources, and so did the Russians. From my understanding, but and also the Iranians knew that the defense positions of the army were not good at all. There was only one line of defense around Idlib, and if one line of defense falls, then there's nothing to fall back on. And so when they attacked and they took the first line of defense, there was nothing to hold them back, and they swiftly went to Aleppo. But in addition to that, Syria, the sanctions have emptied Syria. They've
Yeah.
destroyed Syria. The misery in Syria is because of the sanctions, and the country's been emptied out. On the one hand, the Americans, they imposed the Caesar sanctions on ordinary Syrians, and on the other hand, they steal the oil and the grain from northeastern Syria and export it or use it for their allies. And to the southeast, Americans are working with tribes that were part of ISIS before. And in the north, the Turkish government, or Erdogan, I like to say Erdogan because I don't want to attribute it to Turkey. I have many Turkish friends, even in his party, and many of them have said to me they completely disagree with these policies. In fact, almost everyone I know, even in his party. So I attribute it to Erdogan. Erdogan's his support for these terrorists in the north continue to impose over these last few years have continued to impose um, uh, a heavy burden on the Syrians, and then the Israelis in the south they constantly bomb targets inside Syria. Of course, unlike now, the Syrians would defend themselves, but still the Israelis would cause damage. So uh, over the years, this became worse, and it's sort of like what we have in Cuba now. I was in Cuba a while back, a very beautiful country, a very friendly people, um, but they were really in bad shape. And most young people that I met uh, just wanted to have a better life. They had given up on politics, and I think that that's exactly what the Americans want. The Americans want people to be so desperate that whatever they impose, people will embrace out of desperation.
Mm.
And I'm fearful for Cuba right now. I'm fearful to a lesser degree for Nicaragua, and Venezuela, because that's exactly the policy that the Americans are pursuing in Latin America. And I think countries like China should think about this, because, or Russia or Iran and others, that the weapon, the financial system is a weapon, and it is a deadly weapon, and the Americans are using it effectively. So we often hear that sanctions are, they don't bring down, they don't lead to so-called regime change. But I think in the
They
case of
do.
Syria, sanctions played a key role.
Yeah.
So, a general in the Syrian army earned $40 a month. And
Wow.
some of these al-Qaeda terrorists earn $2,000 a month. So that leads to corruption. And if you do find someone who's not corrupt, that leads to a very miserable state of affairs. The soldiers don't have food to eat, and that's the general. I mean, if the soldiers are paid much less, so um, the I don't even think, and this is my personal analysis, and there's reason to believe that this is correct. I think um, I've heard from others who should know about what's going on inside Turkey. I have reason to believe that Turkey did not expect this sort of success. They were not planning to go all the way to Damascus. They wanted to take Aleppo because that's what Turkey likes to see as its sphere of influence. They consider it to be the Turkey. I mean Erdogan. I don't mean Turks, but Erdogan considers it to be a part of Turkey, or Turkey's sphere of influence. But also they wanted to take that city to put pressure on President Assad to legitimize the Turkish occupation of the north. But then the defenses collapse, and these terrorists move south. And I think that is something. And I think Turkey right now is worried. Turkey is worried about what I was discussing earlier, about the burden, both with regards to the economy, but also with regards to extremism that it's going to impose on the country. So they quickly went to the south. The Iranians, during these days, they told the government of Syria that we are willing to help, but the Syrians didn't give a clear response. And as things got worse, the Iranians told President Assad, and he changed his position a couple of times. And finally, when he said, "Okay," it was too late.
Yeah.
The Damascus was on the verge of collapse. So, but if Iran were to enter, it would be because of al-Qaeda, not because of anything else. In other words, for Iran, this was between a government that was deeply flawed, even back then, but more so now, because sanctions corrupt. Sanctions bring about greater misery. But a government that they saw it as deeply flawed, but at the same time, they always saw ISIS and al-Qaeda and Jaish al-Islam and the others as much more deadly and dangerous.
And we know that, US politicians have openly stated that the purpose of sanctions is to turn the people against the government. That's how they worked in Venezuela. That's how they work in Iran, in Syria. That is the purpose of US sanctions, is to cripple the economy and have the people get so desperate, so angry, not even be able to afford a loaf of bread. It hasn't gotten to that point in Iran, of course, because Iran has always been a powerhouse and, turning these events, to build and manufacture things on their own. But in countries like Venezuela or Syria, like, things have gotten pretty desperate. And they were very desperate inside Syria, to the point where people could literally not afford a loaf of bread. And so the Caesars Act, which targeted the Syrian people, really pushed people, over the brink, to want their government overthrown, to want the regime change. And that's why we're seeing so many Syrians celebrating the fall of Assad. They blamed Assad on the economic, the lack of economic reforms and so forth. And of course, Assad himself, no country is a monolith, right? Of course, there was corruption, and of course, there were so many things that could have been reformed. And I think it's really important to talk about, of course, we should support the Syrian people's want and need for freedom and liberation and, human rights and, reform and all of those things. But Syria was never given that opportunity because it was flooded with Western-backed insurgents. And so for people to say, we have to celebrate this moment because Syrians are now liberated, they're not liberated. They have now, the country has now been sold to al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda that is backed by Israel, backed by Mossad, by the United States, by the CIA, by Turkey, and by these Gulf states. And so I think something that we should talk about is from an Iranian perspective, and you kind of hinted at it, in a few places. What mistakes do you think Assad made that led to this place?
Well, first, I just want to stress on 2 points that you made for your audience. We should all really think about this carefully. I mean, the Holocaust in Gaza, the fact that we've had this for 14 months and the West fully supports it, the Western media fully supports it, I think discredits it completely. And I think it shows that we shouldn't trust anything in the Western media when it comes to Syria or anything else. Gaza has proven them to be completely morally bankrupt.
Absolutely.
But the sanctions used by the West, they are tools that target ordinary people. They are targeting women and children. They're targeting infants. They want to create as much misery as possible. They want people to die because of a lack of medication, and that happens a lot. So this is war against women and children, the sanctions regime, but it's a quiet war.
Yeah.
But it's no less inhumane than when they bomb buildings with bunker busters, when they bomb residential towers, as they did in Lebanon or in Gaza. The second point that I think is key, and that is that the invasion of Syria by a foreign power or a collection of foreign powers through their proxies should be seen as identical to a potential invasion of Cuba or Venezuela or Nicaragua by a foreign power. It is unacceptable, morally unacceptable. I'm not a communist, so I would probably not be a member of the Communist Party in Cuba, but I would always be supportive of the Cuban state, despite whatever flaws it has, in the face of imperialism, in the face of aggression, in the face of US domination, in the face of sanctions. So our view on Syria is the same as our view on Nicaragua, Venezuela, or any other country. We oppose what they did to Libya. Gaddafi was not, in my house there was no poster of Gaddafi. But Libya was the most wealthy country in Africa. And even if it wasn't, that's still not, if it was the poorest country in Africa, it still did not give the US the right to impose sanctions or to use a terrorist organization to undermine the country. So, I think these are things that we should be, your viewers and ourselves, we should be thinking about, because it says a lot. I think it explains a lot about what the United States and the Europeans, the nature of these regimes, what the nature of these regimes are. And it says, and I think it helps explain why it is that we're so opposed to these intervention. It's not just because it's al-Qaeda and they are horrible, but also the very notion of Western intervention is illegitimate. Just like in Iraq, I fought against Saddam Hussein. I was a volunteer in the war. I was gassed twice thanks to German chemical weapons.
Wow.
But when the United States wanted to invade Afghanistan and Iraq, I was probably, maybe I'm wrong, but I think I was in the very first anti-war demonstration in the UK, in Birmingham, when Blair came to inaugurate a European Studies Center or Institute at the University of Birmingham. It was when they wanted to invade Afghanistan. And There were only 50, 60, 70 of us there. And we were protesting against the war. Not because I was a fan of the Taliban, but because I opposed Western intervention in the country. And of course, I participated in the anti-war protests with regards to Saddam Hussein. I fought against Saddam Hussein, but I was opposed to Western intervention against the country, just as I was opposed to sanctions against the country, because they have no moral right to undermine Iraq. So, but with regards to Assad, I think it's difficult to say uh, how much control he had and how much was beyond his control. Because the Ba'athist Party in Syria, I've been to Syria many times, both before the Dirty War in 2011 and after it. During the Dirty War, I'd go there 3, 4 times a year. I'd go to universities. And I should say that I would often, for example, lecture classes uh, in English for students that were interested and spoke English. And students would come up to me after class, and some of them loved Assad. Some of them liked him. Some of them, it was clear, didn't like him. And some of them, it was obvious that they didn't like him at all. But it was almost universal. During those years that I would go to the University of Damascus, that no one liked what the Turks were trying to impose on them. No one wanted ISIS or al-Qaeda. That it was clear, even those who did not like uh, former President Assad. But I think, so I'm not sure how much control, if President Assad wanted to do certain things, how much the party would cooperate with him. Because for the Ba'athist Party there had a lot of control. There were different intelligence agencies. They were in power far before he was. He was not the person who was planned to be the leader of the country. But I think the biggest biggest mistake that he had was that some the that well, let me 2 or 3 things. One is that I think that many of the elites, they were doing much better than ordinary people. Their homes, for example, the restaurants in uh, the wealthy parts of Damascus, even as things were very bad, were full of wealthy people, and the people were having, the restaurants were serving very good food. The last time I went to Syria was just a few months ago, when I was invited by the foreign ministry for a panel discussion. And one of the restaurants that I went to was fantastic, and there were lots of young people there, and they were with their cell phones, and obviously they had a very different lifestyle than the overwhelming majority. And that's, of course, something that I think in Venezuela and Iran and Cuba and everywhere where you have sanctions and you're being targeted by the United States, the government has to be very careful about, because when people are under pressure, you need them more than under normal circumstances. So I think the gap between the elites in Syria and ordinary people was very wide. Another is, I think that it's very clear that the Syrian government should have been much more they should have been much more tolerant to opposition. Of course, I know when you have ISIS and al-Qaeda, it's going to get brutal. War is brutal. But in any case, there are certain things that you just have to do. When we were fighting against Saddam Hussein, we were trained to take as many prisoners as possible. That was our ideology. That's how we were taught. And for example, I remember during probably the most difficult battle of the war, called the Karbala 5 operation, and I was a military diver. When we attacked Iraqi positions, we surrounded a small group of Iraqis, and they were shooting at us. And one of my comrades, he knew some Arabic, so he said, let me go and try to convince them to surrender. And when he went and spoke with them, they killed him. And then the shooting began, and then the Iraqis who were, trapped, there were 14 of them, they surrendered. We didn't do anything to, even though this was a person who lived with us. He was a military diver, and military divers are very close because we're a small group of people. We didn't. Not only that, it was very hot. We were wearing our, the clothes that we wore made it very warm. It was a war. It was a battle. We gave them our canteens. I gave them my canteen because I wanted them to see, look, you're our brothers. We're not your enemies.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how we were taught to deal with these people. And Syrians would tell me that the behavior I don't mean to say everyone in the Syrian army, but the behavior of Hezbollah or troops affiliated to Iran was considerably better than the behavior of many of the soldiers of the Syrian army in dealing with people in areas that were occupied by the terror organizations. So I would say these are the two major things. But at the same time, when the Americans speak about the Syrian dictatorship, all of their allies in our region are dictatorships. But the difference is that all those dictatorships are pro-American, and they have very good ties with the Europeans and the Americans. They have no problems with any of them at all. And also, the Americans have still not closed Guantanamo Bay. The Americans had Abu Ghraib. Abu Ghraib, well, I'm sure you know this. You're much more familiar with these things than I. But you know that the pictures that we see of Abu Ghraib, the famous pictures, actually, 2 or 3 of those pictures is a young Iranian. No one knows this, but he went to Iraq and he was there for pilgrimage, and they just took him. And the guy who's naked and the dog is attacking him. That's a young Iranian. He was on Iranian TV 3-4 years ago explaining his ordeal. But that's not really relevant. Sorry, it was just an interesting footnote.
Well,
the
a man
real
who was
pictures,
on pilgrimage, who was not even,
yeah, but so were a lot of the other Iraqis.
Of course, yeah.
And there were women there who were raped, and it was. But the pictures that we see, those were the pictures that the U.S. government allowed to be released to the public. The really bad pictures are hidden from the public. They're that's what we don't see them. So imagine what those really look like.
Yeah, I mean, it's hypocrisy when the United States and Israel and all these Gulf states, especially the United States, which is the largest exporter of terrorism in the world, cries about human rights and democracy, right? We have our problems here in this country, and we have a foreign policy that is fueled by the blood, by the occupation, by the exploitation of other countries. It is disgusting, and it's completely hypocritical.
And we have an ongoing Holocaust in Gaza.
Yeah, and
an ongoing, nothing that Syria has done, nothing that Egypt has done, nothing that Saudi Arabia has done. Of course, Yemen was horrific, but I mean inside Saudi Arabia, compares to what the Israelis have done in Gaza in front of the eyes of the world. Yeah. So, for the West to be talking about human rights or for countries in the region, which have powerful media because of oil and gas, for them to be talking about freedom when they are the ones who've been funding ISIS and al-Qaeda, that's really that's quite outrageous.
Yeah, I mean, we have to consider that Israel wants all eyes off of Gaza. They want all eyes off of Palestine. They don't want people to talk about a Palestinian state. Israel wants. I mean, I remember talking to people who are pro-Israel, and I would bring up what's happening in Gaza, and they say, you Arabs, you Arabs, always talking about what Israel's doing. Go look at what Assad is doing in Syria. They love to put it back on Assad and what's happening in Syria, without the context, of course, of this Western-backed insurgency. So it's really
Whatever Assad's flaws,
uh,
whatever evil exists in his personality, he was fighting the ISIS and al-Qaeda and their affiliates that Israel and the West and their regional clients had imposed on his country. So when they say he killed his hundreds of thousands of his own people, they're trying to distract attention away from the fact that they are the ones who killed hundreds of thousands of
mhm.
Syrians. They want
Yeah.
to blame him, whereas in reality, there is definitely blood on the hands of the Syrian government, but there's much more blood on the hands of those who carried out this dirty war. And there's even more blood on the hands of the Israeli regime than on the hands of the Americans and the Europeans. Well, Gaza is a joint operation,
Yeah.
but the blood that's on their hands in Gaza is beyond anything else that we've seen, especially because it was carried out in front of cameras and they had no
That was
shame.
live stream. Live, you know, the first live stream genocide in history. Here it is.
Absolutely.
It's what's happening in Gaza. And of course, you know, I talked about this with Kivork before you came on. You know, the people that are celebrating in Syria for the fall of Assad are just one fraction and one piece of the story. There are so many Syrians who are terrified of what's going to come next. And those people and other minorities in Syria are not even mentioned within corporate media circles about, you know, their fears of what this HTS or al-Qaeda takeover means for those groups. But anyways, I know we both have to wrap up very soon, but I just want to kind of end with the future of, you know, U.S. imperialism when it comes to Iran, because now we have a new Trump presidency that's coming up, and you know, Trump is just another war hawk who is surrounded by the very swamp that he claims to have cleansed Washington of. He's got the neoconservatives and all of these people that are very, very hawkish towards Iran. And of course, these are the same kind. These are the same kind of ideologies that dominate, you know, the Biden administration. So it's really, we're not really going to get anything different when it comes to Trump in terms of foreign policy. It seems as though now the mask is going to come off a little bit more again, and we're going to get more people like Marco Rubio, who is really determined to overthrow the government of Nicolas Maduro and do regime change in Iran. So now we have this chaos that has unfolded inside of Syria. Do you think, I guess I have two questions for you that are left. One of them is, will these groups, yes, they're going to create this instability within Syria, but will this group try to attack Iran? Because they've already said our enemy, Jelani himself said, our enemy is not Israel or the West, it's Iran, it's Hezbollah. So what are they going to be attacking Iran? Is Iran, under the impression that they're going to be next in terms of like another proxy war? Or is it going to be more of a direct confrontation from the United States with the Trump presidency coming up? I guess those are two kind of separate questions, but related.
Well, al-Qaeda is definitely a Western tool, and there's no doubt about that. And the very fact that in his first speech he said nothing about Israel, which was bombing Damascus and bombing the country as he was making that speech.
Jelani,
And
yeah.
as they were advancing on Damascus as he was making that speech, he said nothing about animosity towards the Israeli regime. And I find that quite extraordinary. And I think that really it says it all, and that explains why Iran, from the very beginning, was very much against ISIS and Al Qaeda entering Syria. And I think, to be very blunt, it says everything about Erdogan and his relations with Israel and all that. And he is probably the greatest disappointment for our region, because Turkey, if it had been working with the resistance, I think that the Israelis would be on their knees. And if they had joined, they would have tipped the balance. But they did the exact opposite. But in any case, it was a historic moment where if the Turks went in the other direction, Israel would have been devastated. If it had remained neutral, at least, and it never was neutral because it was doing trade, but if it had cut off ties, just cut off ties and cut off the oil, it would have hurt the Israeli regime badly. But what they did is the exact opposite. They went and saved the day for Netanyahu. But I'm sure that these terror organizations will be used in neighboring countries. But I think that these organizations are going to uh, start killing each other as well. I think it's going to be a messy few months ahead. I think the United States and its allies will try to be using these groups to carry out terror attacks, but there it also has blowback because um, the more uh, unstable our region becomes, the more refugees go to Europe, and this is not in the interest of Europe. But Europe and the United States have a tradition of sacrificing their own interests for the sake of the Israeli regime. But these groups will cause another type of blowback, and that is they will make Russia move away from Turkey. They will make China move away from Turkey. They'll make Central Asian countries more cautious about Turkey. So those countries that are supporting the terrorists, there will be a burden, as I said, but that we should also include the international aspect of this. These groups will be at each other's throats, I believe. I'm not saying that they will all be fighting one another, but it's going to be very difficult. I don't think they're going to be able to systematically be organized systematically to go after Iraq. And also the difference between Iraq today and the first time round when ISIS invaded Iraq is that today Iraq has a much stronger military. The Hashid, or the Popular Mobilization Forces, they have the ability to hit back hard. And if indeed Assad was able to stand firm and the army was in place, they would have been able to help hold back ISIS and Al Qaeda. But that, as we discussed earlier, was not to be. So I don't think it'll be very easy for them. They can create unrest in Iraq, and that's dangerous for the West, by the way, for the world, because Iraq is a major oil producer now. And someone said to me that, well, the United States produces its own oil. True, but if the price of oil goes up to $300 a barrel or $200 a barrel, for ordinary Americans, it's going to go up the same price as well. So the people who are producing the oil may be making more money in the United States, but ordinary Americans are going to have to pay a lot more money for their gasoline, for their electric bills, and so on. So these terror organizations, if they're used as tools, they could cause damage. But I do think that they will have a lot of problems, and they'll be fighting with the Kurds. Iraq is a powerful country, relatively speaking. I think the big question is what will happen between the United States and Iran. That is the real, because Iran will strike at Israel. It will happen. I think it's not far off. I don't have any information, but I think it will happen during the Biden presidency. But even if the Israeli regime strikes back and Iran strikes again, for Iran, that's not a big deal. The main question is, will the United States get involved militarily? If it does, then those countries, or those mini states in the Persian Gulf region, those family dictatorships, they will be seen as aggressors because Americans have bases in these countries, and therefore their infrastructure will be fair game. And that means the oil and gas facilities will be destroyed. And Iran has hundreds of thousands of drones and hundreds of thousands of short and medium range missiles. The long range missiles are for Israel, the Israeli regime, but the short range missiles, I mean, the Persian Gulf is not very wide, and it's pretty long, and Iran owns one side of it. That's why it's called the Persian Gulf. So they can easily destroy all through their underground missile sites, all of these oil and gas installations and the tankers. They don't need to even shut down the Strait of Hormuz. There won't be anything to get through the Strait of Hormuz, whether it's open or closed. So that would create a global economic meltdown. That would be catastrophic for the world. And I think there are enough sane people in Washington to recognize that. So in a sense, there's a balance of terror between Iran and the United States. But Washington is full of crazy people too, so we can't be certain about anything.
And it sounds like the United States has created a monster that at some point they're going to be unable to tame, is what you're coming at. And we're already going to start seeing the ramifications of that moving forward. Dr. Marandi, I would love to continue this conversation, but I think we both have to cut it short now, but we will have you on again soon to talk more about US-Iranian relations moving forward, and also what all of this means in terms of BRICS and China relations. As you mentioned, we didn't even get to that, get that far deep into that, but that is definitely going to be the next part of our conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today, and hopefully we'll have you on again soon.
Thank you very